Welcome back, guys, to another AP US History lecture. This time we're going to be talking about the Industrial Revolution. So we moved on from the Civil War era and Reconstruction, and now we're going to be talking about what I really consider to be an entirely different era in American history. Okay, how can I say something like this? Usually when I think of the way US history works, once we get up to the Civil War, that really ends the Jeffersonian era, and it's going to move us into a new era. Now, it's hard to really define what this era is, but I'm going to title it right now a market-based approach. Okay, so what do I mean by that? What I mean is this, is that the North now has built upon the Civil War and increased their attempts to build a national market economy. It's going to be based upon the Industrial Revolution. It's going to be based upon investments into things like the Transcontinental Railroad and moving people out to the West. This attracts new immigrants from places like Southern and Eastern Europe and Asia. Captains of industry start to develop new technologies, organization of how they're going to organize their production and management of workers. And workers are going to respond to some of the problems with this, with unions and some more radical movements as well. The South, too, even attempts to develop what's called the New South, but it's going to end up moving back into racial hierarchies. So my overall thesis is going to be this. The Industrial Revolution in America is a period of reorganization of business and labor. It's going to lead into new fights over the challenges of economic production and inequalities. Now, throughout all this period, we have all those changes, but we still have a continuity. And the continuity is racial inequalities and racial hierarchies. Okay, so let's start off with the development of the Western area. We're no longer really talking about... Okay, so let's start off with the development of the Western area. We're no longer really talking about Western expansion in the way that we did in the 1830s. Now what happens is that we've expanded out into that area. Now it's really settlement of that area and development of the West. There are some major new innovations that allow for this to take place in the late 1800s. It includes things like the diesel engine, the mechanical reaper, barbed wire, and fertilizer. This allows for larger agricultural businesses to start buying up land, but at the same time, we have migrants who are moving out to the West, especially due to the government providing homestead acts. Remember, homestead acts basically said, if you move out for 10 years and you pay like $10, you can have as much land as you want. This attracts a lot of people out to the West, and they're able to do this because of the development of the Transcontinental Railroad. Now, all of these things happening lead to urbanization, and that really was the plan. Over the long term, the idea was if you move people out west, you develop transcontinental railroads, they're going to need to be stopping off places, and these are going to be the development of cities like Chicago, San Francisco, and Los Angeles. Now, this is going to have a huge impact, especially on Native Americans in this region. So Native Americans have been pushed west over and over and over again into what is now being called, what we're used to today, the reservation system. Now, be careful with this. A lot of students think reservations were always the way we dealt with things with Native Americans. It really wasn't. For some time at the beginning of American history, Native Americans were moved, but they were moved to areas where they would own their own land, and that land was kind of under the supervision of the federal government. And that's always been the way that the United States is seen, is that the Native Americans are sort of, they have their own what's called sovereignty, but they're under the supervision of the American government. That's going to change now with something called the reservation system. The reservation system was an attempt to move Native Americans onto areas of land that, again, they would have their own power over, but the American government would be watching over. But the reservations were really meant to get them out of the way so that we could develop transcontinental railroads. This led in the late 1800s to a major war that took place between a group of Native Americans called the Sioux Indians. The Sioux Indians fought against the American cavalry in places like the Dakotas and Montana. And eventually what happened was Sitting Bull, who was one of the major leaders of the Sioux Indians, he was going to lose to the federal government, and he would go into Canada where he got some ability to get some safety. Canada tended to treat the Native Americans with a little bit more respect at that time. But eventually he had to come back. His people just could not survive within that area. When they came back, they were put on 2 reservations, and the federal government passed an act called the Dawes Act. And the purpose of the Dawes Act was to try to assimilate Native Americans. Now, to some extent, the motivation at that time was a good motivation, especially amongst Protestant Christians. The idea was if we could assimilate Native Americans, they would be respected. However, the way that this was done ended up stealing Native American culture. So the idea was, we're going to make the Native Americans like us. We're going to have them wear clothes similar to to American society. We're going to have them develop farms similar to American society. And most important, we're going to have them develop a culture of individualism. This really did not work for Native Americans. Native Americans had a culture of communalism. Be careful of that. It's not communism, it's communalism. The idea behind it was Native Americans would work together in order to produce their wealth over a long time. And they would also have elders of their tribes who would help to manage the long-term future of Native Americans. Plus, there was this notion amongst Native Americans of extended families. So when Native Americans were moved into these individual homes, it caused major depression, caused other problems to happen as well, for example, alcoholism. Then there was a further problem as well. Even being moved onto reservations, what was found on a lot of these reservations was natural resources. For example, gold. So, for example, in one of these cases, Native Americans were being asked not only to move onto reservations, but then being asked to move further out into the reservation, into areas where the land was just extremely poor. And this was meant to be done in order to get the gold on this area. So this was known as the Wounded Knee incident. And at Wounded Knee, what happened was one of the Native Americans, a man named Wovoka, started doing what was called the traditional ghost dance. Now, this really wasn't traditional. It was a new type of dance, but it was based upon traditions. The idea was Native Americans would do a spiritual dance that would help their ancestors to come back and watch over them. Wovoka told the Native Americans that if they did this, they would be protected against the federal forces. So the federal forces ended up moving them into one area, trying to get them to stop to do this dance. During that time, they took away all of the guns from the Native Americans who were at the Wounded Knee, and as they were doing this, one of the Native Americans would not give up his gun. Well, it turned out the reason why was because he was deaf, and he could not hear really what was being asked of him to do. The federal troops misunderstood this, tried to take the gun from him, and that caused somebody to shoot one of their guns, and that led into a massacre in which over 100 men, women, and children were massacred at Wounded Knee. Okay, next region that I want to talk about is the New South. In the New South, a group of reformers from the southern areas decided that the way the South could keep up after losing in the Civil War was to develop their own industrialization. They asked the federal government to invest into roads and highways. We kind of know from studying in Reconstruction this is not what happened. What ended up happening was the South fell back upon racial hierarchies, and they primarily did this with sharecropping. Sharecropping really kept the South farming, and it kept them far behind in competition to the North. The South will catch up, but they won't catch up until after World War II, when they finally decide to start industrializing. Also, remember at this time in 1893, we had the case of Plessy versus Ferguson, and in that particular case, what ends up happening is that the Supreme Court basically validates the idea that it was okay to have separate but equal conditions. So what about the Industrial Revolution itself? So in the 1830s, we had what's called the Market Revolution. The Market Revolution took place in the Northeast, and it was much smaller in scale and based upon old forms of energy like wind and water. In the 1880s, the Industrial Revolution is going to take off, and it takes off because of the use of coal and something called the Bessemer process. So the United States, basically some people went out to Britain and found this process and basically stole the model and brought it back. Pretty typical within international economic relations. The idea of the Bessemer process was to take minerals, put them into a large vat and boil them down, and then blow cold air from underneath the Bessemer vats. And by doing that, you would create steel, which was the most strong metal that they had at that time. So where did you get all the minerals to do this from? Well, it happened to be in the Pennsylvania area, in that Ohio River Valley area. So once again, Ohio River Valley becomes important, this time not for irrigation and for farming, but for getting minerals and using those in order to create steel. So what do you get out of steel? Well, for one thing, you get the Transcontinental Railroad, and that allowed for a market system to take place. Andrew Carnegie is going to integrate the markets for steel. How did he do this? He did it through something called vertical integration. Think of vertical integration as a line going straight up, vertical. And the idea was this: Andrew Carnegie bought up all of the things you needed to do in order to make steel and transport it. By doing that, he eliminated all of his costs. So getting the minerals, transporting them to the factory themselves, and then selling that, all of that he would own. And by doing that, he had vertical integration. Okay, next up is John Rockefeller. John Rockefeller controlled the oil market. The way he did this was through horizontal integration. How did he do this? He basically bought up all of his competition. So think on a horizontal line, all of your different competitors, buying them up. You then control the market. You have no competition. And then last off, probably the most powerful is JP Morgan. He controlled the banks. Think about how powerful banks are since they loan out money to all the people who are trying to industrialize. He created something very complicated called interlocking directorates. So at every single bank, there's a board of directors. JP Morgan would have people go out to local banks and tell them that he would give them a loan if they would allow one of his people to sit on their board of directors. That meant he was basically controlling the decision making of all the local banks. So these are examples of these major captains of industry and how they organized the Industrial Revolution. They were very successful in getting the market going. But what was the impact then on workers? Well, for workers, most of the workers at that time were coming from other parts of the world. They were called the new immigrants. They were coming from Eastern Europe, they were coming from Southern Europe, they were coming from Southeast Asia. The workers faced the following conditions when they came over to the United States. Typically, most workers worked about on average 17 hours per day. They worked 6 days a week, and many of them would end up working 7 days a week to try to make enough money. By the end of a typical week, men made $6 per week, women made $3 per week, and child labor, which started at the age of 8, would make $1.50 per week. They lived in what were called tenement apartments. A tenement apartment was basically a one-room apartment. It was probably half the size of my classroom, and you would typically have anywhere from 6 to 8 people living in that apartment. The working conditions were extremely poor. For example, children working in mining areas would oftentimes get what's called black lung, meaning they would be put down into small holes in the ground where they would chip away at the side of the ground in order to get coal, and as they did that, the dust of the coal would settle into their lungs and clog their lungs up. So why wasn't all this being stopped? Because the government at this time operated under a philosophy called laissez-faire. The idea of laissez-faire was the government would stay out of what was happening, and by doing that, that would allow competition to solve all the problems that were there. Workers kind of said, hey, hold on a second, we're working long hours with poor conditions and poor pay. This is not solving our problems. So how did they respond? Well, most of the time in America, the response was through unions. Unions were an attempt to get workers to collectively organize together and then bargain against their owners in order to try to get better working conditions, better hours, and better pay. Some of the big unions you should remember are the Knights of Labor, which was led by Terence Powderly. Terence Powderly believed that if you integrated all of the workers, so it didn't matter what their skill or race was, there would be more power in that collective bargaining. Another example was the International Workers of the World, who were oftentimes called the Wobblies. This leader was Bill Hayworth. This was a socialist union who believed that you had to change everything and make things into a socialist economy in order to lower the amount of inequalities that were taking place. And then last off, probably the most successful and the most accepted was the AFL, the American Federation of Labor. They were led by a man named Samuel Gompers. Gompers originally was a socialist, but he grew disillusioned with socialism, and so he adopted what he called the bread and butter approach. The bread and butter approach was to have basic issues be met for workers, so keep capitalism, but try to have some basic types of reforms. What would be those examples? Well, one example would be that you would have better pay for workers, so you'd have some kind of minimum wage. Another example would be that you would have better working hours. So originally he went for about 10-hour days and then down to 8-hour days. And you also wanted to see working conditions protected. Unions often face some pretty violent responses back from owners. One of the best examples of this was the hiring of what were called the Pinkerton Detectives. Yes, believe it or not, that was the name of their company. Pinkerton Detectives would go to where there were strikes. Oftentimes the strikes were done in large valleys, and they would basically hide out in the hills and they would snipe away, yes, snipe with guns at union members, and then come riding down with wooden bats into union meetings and try to basically cause enough violence to end union meetings. Okay, what are our big takeaways from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution? Number one, following the Civil War, the country really began moving away from agriculture, away from that Jeffersonian ideal, into a more Hamiltonian ideal of industrialization and urbanization. Number two, business organization was being based much more now on large-scale mass economies, where workers would try to collectively bargain for better pay, working conditions, and hours. But last off, remember, there's a continued problem of racial hierarchies. in the agricultural South that really has not been solved, and it's going to take us into the 20th century. Okay, see you in class.